Okay, everybody. Well, thank you for showing up for for this lecture on the near the end of King Lear. It won't go quite as long, probably as usual. We're just going to focus on Act Four, and I've sent out an outline already, but I'm just going to consult my notes here really quickly. And so, sorry, I'm going to bring up my own outline just to make sure what I've handwritten here I know is a little bit different than what I had texted everybody. So, right. Okay. So first I've got in the background. So there are a couple things that are kind of in the background. I'm not going to say that much about them today, but they are important, obviously, and they are going to be kind of a little bit more important for what happens in Act 5 in the conclusion of the play. So the thing that I'm kind of not going to say that much about today is the Edmund kind of playing off Lear's two older kind of annoying sisters against each other. But it's worth keeping in mind, right, that Regan, who was married to Cornwall, is now a widow, and she's basically got half of the kingdom, and Goneril, who's married to Albany, is Albany's still alive, and she at various points is going to kind of berate and henpeck Albany, accusing him of being a coward and so on. And this is in part because Albany's his interests are kind of complex, right? I mean, on the one hand, he respects King Lear, even though King Lear has done this kind of foolish thing of handing off the kingdom, and he distrusts Cornwall and Regan, basically. And so there was a civil war that was brewing that has been kind of put on pause in order to deal with an invasion. And the thing that Albany is doing at this point, which is complex, right, is that he is trying to repel a French invasion, which happens to be led by the sister of his wife, right? And so, I mean, it's not. I gotta say, it's not like super well fleshed out in terms of like his interests and motives and that kind of thing, and why he would be willing to take up arms in this cause. But anyway, that is the situation that he's finding himself in. And then, of course, you've got Edmund in the background, who is who was a bastard, who was not going to inherit anything, and who has been kind of accommodated by his father and has now sort of pushed his father out, and in fact has betrayed him, and has been made the Duke of Gloucester in his place. And now he has these two very powerful women, the queens of Britain at this point, who are both interested in him, right? Because of his kind of, we think way back to the beginning, to his soliloquy on nature, right? He's got this kind of, sure, customarily, right, he's a bastard and therefore should be kind of shunned by society and whatever, but his kind of natural vitality and strength and virility and so on is showing through, and so they both seem attracted to him very much, and so he's kind of playing them off against each other, right? He's got the possibility that he could very easily marry Regan, right? She's a widow at this point. But he's also, Goneril has kind of been making a stronger play for him, and so he is interested in that. He's kind of playing them off against each other. Anyway, that is going to resolve itself in Act 5. But I'm going to put that in the kind of the background here. The one little bit about that I want to make sure to mention, though, is that you've got Oswald, who is this foppish, weak messenger figure for Goneril. Right, he's a servant in her household, and he's carrying messages for her, and he is carrying a love letter, basically, because Goneril is worried that because Regan has appointed Edmund to lead her forces, right? Because theoretically, right, a woman isn't supposed to lead an army and that kind of thing. So Edmund is leading her army. And so he's spending more time with her, and so Goneril is worried that Regan is going to get Edmund to marry her, and so she sends this letter. It's an incriminating letter. Right? She sends this letter to Edmund via Oswald that is, professes her love, and basically is kind of, well, I mean, it's inappropriate in all kinds of ways, and that letter gets intercepted because Oswald tries to kill Gloucester, who's a criminal as far as everybody's concerned at this point, and there's a price on his head, a bounty on his head. And so Oswald is trying to kind of, get further preferment by killing off Gloucester, but he ends up fighting with Edgar, who gets killed. Who kills him, and so Edgar acquires this incriminating letter that Oswald had in his possession. Okay, and that's in Act 4, Scene 5, around line 248. It's kind of an interesting moment. I'm not going to get into it too much, but, like I've mentioned that we've read, I'm hoping that you'll see this, right? We've read enough plays together that you'll see certain kind of tropes that are getting, that is dramatic situations that get reused in different kinds of ways, right? And so that scene, for instance, might remind you at least a little bit of other plays that where Shakespeare has characters who are writing letters and then people reading them and kind of not sure if they're interpreting them correctly and that kind of thing. And at least in 12th, even like the language that he uses as he's opening the letter sounds a little bit like Malvolio opening the letter in Twelfth Night that he thinks is from Olivia, when in fact, of course, it's been written by Maria. Anyway, okay, but on to the kind of the core of our lecture for today, and that is, so the first thing I want to focus on is what I called on the outline filial care finally. So the middle part of the play has been about showing filial ingratitude, right? We've had Goneril and Regan who are harassing their father, driving him out of doors, eventually kind of driving him mad. He loses his grip on reality and on sanity. And you've got Edmund, who has tricked his father. He is himself the bastard, illegitimate, and so on. He's tricked his father and essentially pushed his legitimate brother Edgar out, and then replaces his own father. Right. So you've got great examples of filial ingratitude. And finally, near the end of the play, we're going to see scenes of filial care, of filial gratitude. So I want to turn to Act 4, Scene 1. And so, if you recall, in Act 3, Edgar, and I mentioned this last time, right? We want to keep in mind that Edgar is in disguise and that sort of thing. And so in Act 3, Edgar has had a chance to see that Gloucester is repenting, just as Lear has repented, having been so harsh with Cordelia. Gloucester is starting to repent, having reacted so strongly against Edgar. And so Edgar's already seen that, right? Because he was in disguise when Gloucester was talking with Lear and Kent and so on. And in Act 4, Edgar has been he's separated off from the Lear-Kent group, Lear-Fool-Kent group. And of course, also, by the way, the Fool is never going to be seen again. He just kind of drops out of the play after Act 3, Scene 6. And so there's this kind of very brief, it's not exactly it's a soliloquy technically, right? It's very brief, though. At the very beginning of Act 4, Scene 1, Edgar says, "Yet better thus, and known to be contemned, than still contemned and flattered. To be worst, the lowest, and most dejected thing of fortune stands still in esperance, lives not in fear. The lamentable change is from the best. The worst returns to laughter." Okay, so there's a couple things about this little speech, right? It has this idea about a kind of the wheel of fortune, right? The idea that everybody, particularly important figures, but everybody goes through this kind of cycle of something out external, right? Fortune that is kind of controlling and sending things at us, and how we're kind of responding to that. And this may bring us low, but it may not be a permanent kind of low, right? It will cycle back up, kind of thing. And it also encapsulates a kind of a key theme for many of the characters in the play, right? The play, the tragedy, right, is in part about many characters having had an artificial sense of themselves and needing to have that kind of sense of self ripped away so that they can encounter like just the bare minimum, like who they really are deep down, or what the world is really like deep down, right? And so when Edgar says, "Yet better thus," right? So he's talking about himself, and he's talking about the idea that he is disdained, cast off, shunned. He doesn't have anything going for him at this point. He's starving and is barely clothed and has just weathered this terrible storm. And like this kind of, picking up on things that Lear has said about, all the kind of luxury and kind of ornate existence that he has had to kind of like strip that away, right? And this is the same thing with Edgar. So better thus and known to be contemned than still contemned and flattered, right? So that to be have a kind of false consciousness, a false sense of self, have everybody kind of flattering you, and not realize how bad things really are for you and for the world and so on. He's learned something. He's claiming here, right? And then this idea about the Wheel of Fortune, right? To know where you are, then you can kind of confront your fortune more effectively, more accurately, that kind of thing, right? So, I mean, and there's an iron. There's going to be an irony about this this little speech, right? He thinks, okay, now I know where I stand. And then the very next thing that happens is that his father, who has had his eyes taken out, right, who has had his eyes squished out by Cornwall late in Act 3, is led on stage by a blind man, by an old man, and when Edgar sees that, at line 25 or so, he says, in an aside, right? He's not speaking to anybody other than basically to us in the audience. Again, not exactly a soliloquy, but I mean, it's a kind of an awareness. And he says, "Oh gods, who can say I am the worst? I am worse than ever I was," right? So just 20 lines earlier, at the beginning of this scene, he was thinking, okay, I've hit rock bottom. Now I know where I am, and I can kind of build from here. And suddenly, in comes his father in this kind of pathetic situation, and he realizes, man, it's even worse than I thought. And he says again at line 25 or so at the bottom of this is on page 89, at the very bottom of the page, and worse I may be yet, the worst is not, as long as we can say this is the worst, right? So wherever, I mean, this is a very kind of nihilistic sort of view, right? But the idea that you hit what you think is rock bottom, if you're able to say this is rock bottom, maybe there's a deeper rock bottom than that, right? I mean, it's a pretty grim sort of assessment of things, and it's it's being brought on by the fact that he's watching his father, who he has cared about all along, right, being led along by an old man because he's lost his eyesight. And then related to that, I want to make sure I mention that I talked last time about the idea of language about vision and seeing and things like this, right? And so Gloucester says, this is again at very beginning of Act 4, it's Act 4, Scene 1, line 11. He says to the old man, "Get thee away, good friend, begone. Thy comforts can do me no good at all. They thee may hurt," right? So I am a hunted man at this point. So, thank you for all you've done and go away. The old man, "Alack, sir, you cannot see your way. You're blind. How are you you're out in the middle of nowhere. How are you going to proceed from here?" They haven't seen Edgar disguised as the madman, poor Tom. And Gloucester, "I have no way," right? I'm not going anywhere. "I have no way, and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw. Full oft 'tis scenes our means secure us, and our mere defects prove our commodities. Ah, dear son Edgar, the food of thy abused father's wrath, might I but live to see thee in my touch, I'd say I had eyes again," right? This is a very kind of complex, not complex, but a really kind of moving speech, right? So one, I stumbled when I saw, right? That's literally true, right? People stumble all the time, even when they have perfect vision. But also the idea that when I was seeing, it didn't do me any good, right? Like when I actually had eyes with which to see, it didn't do me any good because, I stumbled, I made a mistake, and I trusted what I was seeing in Edmund and distrusted what I was seeing in Edgar. My vision wasn't doing me any good, right? And this connects back with, again, the Kent's kind of quibble on when King Lear says, "Out of my sight," and Kent responds, "See better, Lear," right? And now he's in this kind of, he's had this moment of recognition in the previous scene, right? When he was calling out for Edmund, and Regan says, "Edmund's the guy who betrayed you, you idiot." And now he realizes, oh man, I completely misjudged my own son Edgar. And so to say, if only I could have Edgar here and see him with my touch, right? He's not ever going to see Edgar again, but like that he could know that Edgar was there again. And in fact, right, he is. Edgar is just right, just on the other side of the stage. Then I would say that I had eyes again, even though obviously he wouldn't have eyes, right? But he would feel like he was seeing the important thing. Right? He would be touching Edgar, responding to Edgar, reconnecting with Edgar, and that would be enough. And this is the thing that drives Edgar to say, God, you think you're at the bottom, and that's not the bottom. There's a deeper bottom. I mean, I'm not going to go into it here, but I mean, like, Gloucester himself is also going to start talking in the same language, right? I mean, the idea that we live in a cruel universe, not a we don't have a benevolent universe. We have a malevolent universe. That the gods that we are as flies are to wanton boys, that we are to the god they kill us for our sport. I mean, this is what seems to have happened, right? That the world is kind of stacked against them in some ways. Okay, so I mean, Act Four. For me, the main thing about Act Four is this kind of reconciliation between Edgar and his father, between Edgar and Gloucester. And again, right, you have to keep in mind, right, that at this point Gloucester can't see. I mean, the actor obviously who's playing him can see, but he's supposed to be pretending that he can't. But all the way through this, right, Gloucester does not realize that his own son, the son that he's longing to reconnect with and reconcile with, that his own son is right in front of his eyes, right in front of his face. And so that Edgar is in disguise all the way through this, and that just kind of makes all this kind of language of, like, Edgar can ask Gloucester and understand what Gloucester's going through. Gloucester doesn't realize that it's his own son that he's talking to. And so you see this kind of filial care, right? I mean, Edgar is concerned about his father and trying to take care of him. And that reaches its kind of big kind of culmination in Act 4, Scene 5, with I guess I'll talk about that just briefly here, and then I'm going to come back to it in a minute. But with this, I mean, you can think of it as a kind of it's not exactly a trust fall, but it's like a trust fall, right? I mean, like at this point, Gloucester is suicidal, right? He wants to kill himself. The universe is wicked, and he doesn't want to have a part of it anymore. And so he asks this person who he doesn't realize is his son, lead me up to the top of the cliffs of Dover. And he doesn't say why, but I mean, he's going to throw himself off the cliff and kill himself and end his life and stop all of his suffering and so on, right? And Edgar he recognizes what's happening, right? And so he sets his father up basically to go through what looks like a suicide gesture, which is not really going to be a suicide gesture, and that this is going to maybe redeem Gloucester's life and that kind of thing. Okay, now the other aspect of filial care is that Cordelia returns at this point in Act 4. Her return to Britain has been alluded to a couple of times, right? When she left, in Act 1, Scene 1, she said to her sisters, you need to follow through on those promises you've made to our father. And there have been allusions ever since then to the fact that she has got an army together to kind of come to Lear's aid. And of course, that is also that's the kind of chronicle or historical material that Shakespeare is working with. Is and by the end of Act 4, right, that's where Shakespeare is going to finally kind of diverge from the history that he has been working with, right? That in the kind of historical moment, the historical material, Cordelia leads an army and is actually able to restore Lear to his throne, right? And Shakespeare's going to change that in the play here. Anyway, and also just a little side note, but just in terms of the staging of things, I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. There are 20 or 30 characters in this play, and there's only usually 10 or 12 actors in the company, and so some of these characters, some of the roles have to be played by more than one person. Some people have to play more than one role, and there's a long tradition of the Fool and Cordelia being played by the same actress. Both because they are both characters who are trying to tell the truth to Lear, and they're never on stage at the same time. And so when Cordelia comes back here in Act 4, the Fool, you'll notice, disappears from the play, and so that anyway. So that's just an interesting kind of side note if you want to consider that. Anyway, but in Act 4, Scene 3. You have a report about Cordelia's return and about how she's worried about Lear. And then in Act 4, Scene 3b, this is on page 99, you have Cordelia hearing about the fact that her father has gone mad, that he's in the vicinity but he's missing, and that that people are sent out to look for him. And she says, this is on page 100 near the top, "Oh, dear Father, it is thy business that I go about." Act 4, Scene 3, around line 23. "Oh, dear Father, it is thy business that I go about. Therefore, great France, my mourning and important tears hath pitied." That is, the King of France has, given her an army to try to lead, to restore Lear. "No blown ambition doth our arms incite, but love, dear love, and our aged father's right. Soon may I hear and see him." And then, so this is, she's here on his behalf, trying to do him justice. And then Act 4, Scene 6, and so this is, that's on my notes. I'm going to come to 4-6. Yeah, so I'm going to pause. I'm not going to go back to 4-6 here yet, but just to kind of set up, right, that Cordelia is here to try to do right for her father, that she's acting for his good, and so on. And we're going to come back and look at the actual moment of restoration in just a second. Okay, point number 2 for today, on this, or is it point 3 now? On my little outline. Yeah, sorry, point number 3, metadrama. So, we've talked about and we've seen that Shakespeare uses the language of theatricality quite a bit in all the plays we've been looking at, right? And he's constantly acknowledging, right? Well, he's not directly acknowledging, right? But he is using a theatrical language in a theatrical space, and we're invited as an audience to consider what's going on with all that, right? And so there is a very kind of theatrical scene here, and this is Act 4, Scene 5. And so this, and we're going to come back and look at this in a little bit more in a second, right? But this is the scene of Edgar in disguise, or Edgar. He is in disguise, but it's also the fact he could just be Edgar at this point, and Gloucester wouldn't recognize that it was Edgar. But Gloucester with his unrecognized son Edgar, arriving in Dover, where the kind of famous White Cliffs of Dover are, because Gloucester has in mind that he's going to throw himself from this great height and kill himself, and Edgar recognizes this too, right? At line 32 of Act 4, Scene 5, Edgar says, "Why I do trifle with his despair is done to cure it," right? He knows that his father is in despair. He knows he imagines what his father is about to try, because his father's been insistent. "Hey, stranger, do you know how to get to the cliffs of Dover? Can you lead me there?" So Edgar's not dumb. He knows what this is all about. And so he's putting on he's going along with this sort of, right? But he's putting on, this is the thing I wanted to get to, he's putting on a performance, right? The very beginning of Act 4, Scene 5. Gloucester, "When shall we come to the top of that same hill," right? The cliffs that he's been trying to get to. Edgar, "You do climb it up now. Look how we labor." Gloucester, "Methinks the ground is even, flat." Edgar, "Horrible steep." "Hark, do you hear the sea?" Gloucester, "No, truly. Why then your other senses grow imperfect by your eyes' anguish. So may it be indeed. Methinks thy voice is altered, and thou speakest with better phrase and matter than thou didst," right? So there's a kind of an awareness that, the actor who's playing Edgar has kind of let the disguise slip a little bit there, right? Okay, but so, thinking back to, let's say, the most famous, there are a couple famous scenes that we've talked about so far this semester where there's this kind of theatricality going on, right? The one I was about to mention. So thinking back to all the stuff going on with Midsummer Night's Dream, that's a kind of most extended discussion of that kind of thing, right? But in Henry IV Part 1, when Falstaff and Hal pretend that the tavern is a court, right, the royal court, and that the stool is a throne, and the dagger is a scepter, and a cushion is a crown, and so on, right? This is like that, right? Now, Edgar is trying to persuade Gloucester that even though they're in the middle of a flat field with nothing dangerous around them, that Gloucester, who can't see anything, is walking up a very steep incline so that he can get to the edge of this cliff, right? Now, so in itself, that's already a performance, a moment of theatricality, right? How do you do this, right? But it's also kind of theatrical in a sort of double way, right? Because even if you're in the theater and you actually do want to have an actual cliff for a character to be standing next to, you would still have to perform all the stuff to persuade an audience that the characters are laboring to go up a cliff and so on and all that, right? I mean, because there's no cliffs in the theater, right? I mean, they would have to kind of do something to kind of persuade you that these characters are struggling to get up a cliff and that kind of thing, right? So I mean, there's this kind of double theatricality, right? This is, I mean, is the audience, as you're sitting there, when Edgar says, "Look how we labor," I mean, that's what he would say if the actor was trying to kind of persuade the audience that they were going up that these characters were going up a cliff and so on. And so you might, at least theoretically, be in a position to kind of go, wait a second, are they going up a cliff or not, right? Okay, and then, I mean, there is this kind of really famous, well, not famous, but I mean, there's a kind of a word picture here that Edgar paints for Gloucester to persuade them that they're at the top of a cliff. Come on, sir, here's the place. This is line 12 or so. Stand still, how fearful and dizzy 'tis to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appeared like mice, and yon tall anchoring bark diminished to her cock a buoy, almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebble chafes cannot be heard, it is so high. I'll look no more, lest my brain turn and the deficient sight topple down headlong. Right. So here's this kind of how to describe what it would be like to a blind man to be standing at the top of a cliff so that he can get the perception that he's up high, right? And you are now within a foot, he says at line 27, of the extreme verge. For all beneath the moon would I not leap upright, right? Dr. Fleck, I'm afraid of heights. And Edgar is trying to persuade Gloucester that he's afraid of heights, right? If I was standing at the edge of the cliff, I would never jump up straight, lest I might accidentally kind of throw myself off the edge of a cliff. And he's pretending, right, that he doesn't know why Gloucester is up there, even though, of course, he does. Okay. And so Gloucester is persuaded, or he seems to have been persuaded, that he is at the edge of a cliff, right? He's at the edge of the cliffs of Dover. And now he's left alone, or nearly alone, and says, this is around line 33, "O you mighty gods, this world I do renounce, and in your sights shake patiently my great affliction off. If I could bear it longer, and not fall to quarrel with your great opposeless wills, my snuff and loathed part of nature should burn itself out." Right? I'm old. If I knew that I could, persist through this, I would. But I'm more likely to become even more full of despair and, blaspheme the gods or whatever, and therefore I'm going to end my life now. If Edgar live, oh, bless him. Now, fellow, fare thee well. Gone, sir, farewell, right? Because Edgar is supposed to be this guy who's walking back down the cliff. And then from his knees, Gloucester falls forward, right? He's trying to throw himself off of a cliff. And Edgar, and yet I know not how conceit may rob the treasure of life, when life itself yields to the theft. Had he been where he thought, by this had thought been past, right? If Gloucester were on the edge of a cliff, now he would be dead, right? And now Edgar is going to create a miracle out of all this, right? It was completely staged, right? But he's going to turn this whole fall into a miracle. And now he changes characters again. What are you, sir? He says, right? So coming up to him with a new voice. Gloucester, away and let me die. And Edgar, hadst thou been aught but gossamer, Act 4, Scene 5, line 49. Hadst thou been aught but gossamer, feathers, air, so many fathom down, precipitating, thou hadst shivered like an egg. But thou dost breathe, hast heavy substance, bleedst not, speakst, art sound. 10 masts at each make not the altitude, which thou hast perpendicularly fell. Thy life's a miracle. Speak it again. So now, I mean, Gloucester doesn't necessarily know any better, right? So Edgar is trying to persuade him that he was at the top of the cliff, that he threw himself off, and that some kind of miraculous thing has happened to make it possible for him to float to the ground from the top of the cliffs of Dover, right? So, I mean, he has to work at it, right? But what he's trying to persuade Gloucester is that there's something, special about him, right? Some reason that the gods, instead of letting him throw himself off a cliff, have preserved him. Gloucester, but have I fallen or no? Edgar, from the dread summit of this chalky bourne, look up a height. The shrill gorged lark so far cannot be seen or heard. Do but look up. Which is, painful, right? To say to a guy who's lost his eyes, alack, I have no eyes. Does wretchedness deprive that benefit to end itself by death? 'Twas yet some comfort when misery could beguile the tyrant's rage and frustrate his proud will. And so, and now what Edgar does, right, is to start suggesting that poor Tom, the character who led Gloucester to the top of Dover, was was a demon, a devil, right? Some kind of infernal spirit. And Gloucester starts to buy into this, right? He says, the thing you speak of, I took it for a man. Often would it say, the fiend, the fiend. He led me to that place, right? So was his despair, was Gloucester's despair, was Gloucester's suicidal thoughts, was Gloucester's attempt at suicide all part of an infernal, a wicked spirit kind of leading him away? And that if it hadn't been for that, maybe his divinity, his life, would have had that kind of more better purpose, and that maybe that's why he's been preserved, right? So I mean, yes, on the one hand, you've got Edgar in terms of filial care, right? He's he's leading his father along. And he has saved his life. He's prevented him from killing himself. But even more than that, because I don't know that much about suicide, but I suppose if you've tried to kill yourself once, you might try again, right? But that Edgar has done something even more than that, which is to try to kind of make Gloucester feel more whole, feel that there's some kind of special purpose to his life, so that Gloucester won't try this again, right? So it's a healing that's beyond just sort of having prevented him from killing himself, but trying to kind of persuade him not to do it again, right? Okay. Now, so that's the second point I wanted to make, just about metadrama and all that kind of thing. Now, Act 5 or Act 4 Scene 5 is a fairly long scene, so the next important part of this is that Lear is going to come in his having lost his grip on reality, right? In my outline, I said that it's Lear's mental state, and it's, thinking about Lear's mental state is a complex one, right? He is an old man, right? And so he's already a little bit in his dotage, a little bit senile. He is driven to despair by the way his daughters have turned on him, right? So that's not just his senility, right? He is on the verge of becoming insane. And then there's been this storm, his kind of weathering of this extreme storm, both internal and actual material storm. And so his mental state is fragile. And so having come out on the other side of that storm, he's only kind of partially in, partially out of his grip on reality, right? And so he comes in wearing, this has been described earlier, that he was seen walking around with a crown of flowers picked up from the hedgerows and so on. And so, in fact, the stage direction is on page 105. It's Act 4, Scene 5, around line 81. Enter Lear, mad. That is, insane. And so at line 83, his words are, "No, they cannot touch me for coining. I am the king itself." And so now he's kind of talking to things that aren't there. Nature's above art in that respect, he says at line 86. "There's your press money." So he's speaking to imaginary people. "There's your press money. That fellow handles his bow like a crow keeper. Draw me a clothier's yard. Look, a mouse. Piece, this toasted cheese will do it. There's my collar." He's not really in his right mind at this point, right? It's all kind of nonsense. And Gloucester recognizes the voice. He can't recognize his face, right? Um, and um, and um, and Lear, there's a kind of truth in the madness that he's speaking at this point. Um, and so when he says at line 104 in this kind of sort of weird madness, I mean, he's like commenting on Goneril and Regan. Ha, Goneril, ha, Regan, they flattered me like a dog and told me I was the white hairs in my beard or air, the black ones were there, and so on, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, at the end of that, go to, they are not men of their words. They told me I was everything. 'Tis a lie. I am not ague-proof, right? I'm not above, the common humanity that can get sick of, the plague or COVID-19 or whatever, right? But I mean that I am human as well as king and so on, right? And so he's coming to an understanding that being a king doesn't make him better than other people, right? He's not impervious to disease. He feels heat, he feels cold, he feels hunger, and he feels disease and so on. Gloucester, the trick of that voice, this is at 105, the trick of that voice I do well remember, because he's blind, right? Is it not the king? And Lear, I, every inch a king, right? Yeah, you called me the king, and yeah, I am a king. When I do stare, see how the subject quakes. I pardon that man's life. What was my cause? Adultery? Thou shalt not die for adultery. No, right? So, I mean, he's acting, like the king and so on, right? But, it's coming out of madness at this point, right? So, I mean, it's a kind of complex understanding of where he is with that. But one thing that doesn't change, right, is he hates his daughters, right? Down from the waist, they're centaurs, the women all above, right? I mean, there's this kind of very misogynistic set of comments here about, how his daughters have betrayed him and so on. Okay, and now, I mean, again, we have various language about seeing, right? Gloucester is seeing things more clearly, and Lear is kind of seeing things more clearly, although it's mixed in with all this madness and so on. And now, Cordelia's officers come to try to find him to do him good and bring him home. But he runs, and it takes a little while to get him. But eventually, in Act 4, Scene 6, Act 4, Scene 6, he's been apprehended, right, and brought to Cordelia's camp. You have a bit here about the doctors, worrying about madness and how to care for it and so on, which, like we just had a scene like this with the Doctor and Lady Macbeth in the previous tragedy, which is from right around the same time, right? So, I mean, Shakespeare's got, doctors and their ability to kind of help the people whose brains have turned or don't have a clear grip on reality, kind of in mind. But then, so this is, I mean, there's this kind of joyful feeling here in Act 4, Scene 6, this reconciliation or restoration of the father and his adored youngest daughter, right, the baby of the family, whom he loved and adored and had expected to have an ongoing relationship with, and who, out of his own kind of madness, right, had reacted so strongly against her in Act 1, Scene 1. But anyway, so we're at Act 4, Scene 6, around line 25. So they're going to very gently, they've given him sedatives to try to kind of calm his mind and his, his consciousness, right? And so he's sleeping, and now they're going to play some music that is appropriate for, like some kind of soft music maybe or something like that. And Cordelia is going to try to speak to him and see if she can, not shock him too much, but kind of bring him back into a kind of more settled state. So at line 25, Act 4, Scene 6, oh, my dear father, like he's still asleep. Oh, my dear father, restoration, hang thy medicine on my lips, and let this kiss repair those violent harms that my two sisters have in thy reverence made. Right? So, this, I'm the true, loyal, real daughter. I'm going to try to make things better. At line 30, had you not been their father, these white flakes that his white hair had challenged pity of them, right? Wouldn't you be kind to an old man, even if he wasn't your father? Was this a phase to be exposed against the warring winds? to stand against the deep, dead, bolted thunder, in the most terrible and nimble stroke of quick cross lightning, to watch poor Perdue with this thin helm, mine injurious dog, though he had bit me, should have stood that night against my fire. And wast thou fain, poor father, to hovel thee with swine and rogues forlorn in short and musty straw? Alack, alack, 'tis wonder that thy life and wits at once had not concluded all. Right? I mean, this is Cordelia's pity of her father. Even if he was just any old man, I would not have turned him out of doors like that. But he was your father. How could Regan and Goneril do this? How does my royal lord? How fares your majesty? Lear, you do me wrong to take me out of the grave. Thou art a soul in bliss, but I am bound upon a wheel of fire, that mine own tears do scald like molten lead. Right? He's worried that he's imagining this, and that this is a torment to torment him, this forsaken and forlorn person, father, king, with this image of Cordelia, the woman that the daughter that he loved and who he's wronged. Sir, know me. You're a spirit, I know. Where did you die? Still far away. Right? He's not in there yet, right? And then, he's going to say things. I mean, I believe these are things you say to people when they come out of a, having fainted or been unconscious or whatever. Do you know what day it is? Do you know where you are? Where did you sleep last night? Where have I been? Where am I? Fair daylight? I'm mightily abused. And I mean, he's doing something, right? He sees Cordelia and he kneels. And Cordelia, oh, look upon me, sir, and hold your hands in benediction o'er me. No, sir. You must not kneel, right? I mean, Lear is recognizing that he wronged her and wants to kind of ask her forgiveness. And his kneeling here is genuine, right? If you recall back in Act 2, when Regan had said that Lear should go back and reconcile with Goneril, that he had mocked the idea of kneeling to his daughter and asking for forgiveness. But now he is genuinely doing it here. And then he's just not sure of himself. Pray do not mock. I'm a very foolish old man. Do not laugh at me, for as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child Cordelia, and so I am. Be your tears wet? Yes, Faith, I pray, weep not. If you have poison for me, I will drink it. I know you do not love me, for your sisters have, as I do remember, done me wrong. You have some cause, they have not, right? So your sisters who owe me something were willing to have me killed. You who don't owe me something, and in fact who've been wronged, if you wanted to kill me, I would deserve it, he basically is saying, right? Cordelia, no cause, no cause. Am I in France? In your own kingdom, sir. There's a kind of irony about in your own kingdom here, because he's not really a king anymore, right? Do not abuse me, he says. Be comforted, good madam. The great age you see is cured in him, right? So there's been this kind of beginnings of a reconciliation. And it's going to play out a little bit more in Act 5, right? There's going to be more of them enjoying their company and feeling finally reconnected. And Lear, of course, painfully aware of how he has mistreated Cordelia and can't believe that she's willing to be so forgiving of him and so on, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop the lecture there.